Thank you so much. I appreciate it. But you still have to listen to me first. Hi, I'm Jude. I'm the program director here at the East Meadow Public Library, and I'm here today with other staff, Kelly Gordon, Charlie Faso, and Julia. Where are her parents? Just say her name. Say it louder. Incomizia. It's close? I don't know why I find that hard to say. And they've helped put this whole evening together. And of course, there's Larry Mosier, the sound guy. I got glasses down. I want to thank the Buyer's Choice Company for arranging this tour. They've been absolutely wonderful and so understanding and so supportive. You know those little coral figures? Like that? They make those. And so they sponsor Gerald on these tours. I just want to get some housekeeping out of the way. Please, no taking of pictures and no recording. We are streaming this. You might find the camera in your way, so you can just move over if you want to. You want to wear a mask, feel free to do that. The entrances are stage right, stage left, and in the back of the house. Oh, please turn off your cell phones and really do it this time because it's going to be very disturbing. Now, not only is he Charles Dickens' great-great-grandson, yeah, that's fine, but he's an amazing actor. You are very fortunate tonight. Oh, hi, Mary. You're going to have a wonderful, wonderful time. Let's hear it again for Gerald Dickens.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jude. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back here and to be able to perform some other parts of my repertoire. You were here to see A Christmas Carol last year, many of you. But this is one of my favorite programs to perform back home in England. They're two short stories. They don't come from any of Dickens's novels. They were both written for his magazine All the Year Round. One was published in 1865, the other one in 1866. Now the first one, the first half, The Signalman, is a ghost story. Now we know Dickens loved ghost stories. I mean, his most popular work is a ghost story, A Christmas Carol being a ghost story of Christmas. But this one, The Signalman, is different. It's darker, it's more intense, it's more personal. And there's a very good reason for that, and I'd just like to explain that before I actually begin The Signalman itself. On the 9th of June, 1865, Charles Dickens woke up in Paris, and that day he was due to travel back to London. Now that meant an early start to the day. He got on a train in Paris, took the train all the way to the port town of Boulogne, where he boarded a steamer, the steamer Victoria, which took him across the English Channel, where he arrived at the English port of Folkestone. And at Folkestone, he boarded another train, which would take him all the way through the county of Kent into the heart of London. And the day started well. He got the train in Paris, he arrived at the port, the steamer left on time. It was a beautiful sunny day, so it was a calm crossing, there were no problems there. And the steamer arrived in Folkestone, where the train left for London. Dickens settled himself back in his first-class carriage and enjoyed the journey. But way, way up the line, about halfway between Folkestone and London, there is a little town called Staplehurst. And at Staplehurst, there was work being carried out on the rail line. Now, at Staplehurst, there is a river, the River Bult, and it's a meandery river. It goes backwards and forwards, this way and that, so that the dead straight rail line on that stretch crosses the river on 3 different occasions, traveling over a series of viaducts. Now, each of those viaducts were built out of timber. They had timber frames, timber beds, then there was iron on top and the rail on top of that. Now, over the years, the timber had rotted and needed replacing. All 3 viaducts had to have all their timber replaced. Now, that meant taking off the rails, taking off the iron, taking off the timber bed, replacing it with new timber, putting the iron back on, putting the rails back on. Now, doing this over viaducts meant that while the iron beds and the rails were up, it meant there was a gap in the line where the bridge should have been. There was nothing. So this was seen at the time as being a little dangerous. So regulations were put in place. If there was a gap in the line over a bridge, there were many, many regulations in place that would prevent any sort of catastrophe. Now, the first of these was how the repair was categorized, how it was dealt with. It should have been what was called a protracted repair. Now, as this work took 10 weeks to carry out, you'd think that sounds pretty protracted. And a protracted repair meant that it was listed in all the bulletins, all the drivers got details of it, the signals would be at danger, the train would have to go very slowly, and the works would have to be inspected every week by the superior. The superior didn't really want to inspect the works every week. So he decided not to list them as a protracted repair. He listed them as a daily repair. And the reason he said that was because each little section of line could be done in a very short time. So he reckoned each bit was a separate bit of work, could be called a daily repair. That means they weren't published, the drivers didn't know, nothing was done. That was the first problem. But there were more fail-safes in place. If the line was being taken up over a bridge, it was very important to know if there were any trains coming or not. So the foreman of the works, in this case a man called Henry Benge, had to study his timetable. First thing in the morning, he sat down with his timetable to check when the trains would be coming. Now, most of the time, this wasn't a problem because the trains were local and they came at the same time every day. The problem lay with what was called the tidal train. Now, the tidal train was the one Dickens was riding on because it met the steamer coming across the English Channel, and because of the tides in the channel, it left at a different time every day. There were big discrepancies in the timetable, but Henry Benge had his copy of the timetable. And to make sure no further mistakes were made, he had to read his timetable in the company of another member of the team who read another copy of the timetable. And they would sit next together at 6 o'clock in the morning and read the timetables together. Well, on the 9th of June, 1865, Henry Benge read his timetable. But the other timetable, belonging to the chief carpenter, wasn't present. Why? Because it'd been run over and cut in two by a train the day before. You couldn't make this stuff up, could you? So there was only one timetable. But that shouldn't have mattered. Henry Benge checked it carefully. They'd been working for 10 weeks. This was the last day of the work. Hadn't been any problems before. Unfortunately, Benge read the wrong page of the timetable. He read the entry for the 10th of June, the next day. And on that day, the train was due to come past at 5:15 in the afternoon. 5:15, we'll have the rails back down by then. On the 9th of June, the train was due at 3:15, 2 whole hours before. But even then, there were still more fail-safes in place. Whenever there was a gap in the line over a bridge, one member of the crew was given a red flag and sent way, way up the line, ready to display it if a train should happen to come along when they weren't expecting it. Now, the man given the flag was a man called John Wiles, and he was supposed to go, according to the regulations, 1,000 yards up the line to display the flag. Now, this would mean that the train coming along at 50 miles an hour, top speed, would have plenty of time to shut off steam, put on the brakes, and it would come to a halt before it got to the bridge. The problem was John Wiles didn't know much about distances. Wasn't quite sure what 1,000 yards looked like. But he reckoned, he guessed, that the telegraph poles along the track were probably about 100 yards apart. Probably, give or take. So if he counted 10 of those, he'd be 1,000 yards. Wonderful. So off he went, counting the telegraph poles. 1, 2. Unfortunately, on that bit of line, the telegraph poles were very close together. 10 telegraph poles only took him 544 yards, not 1,000, half the distance. Now, how on earth do I know all this stuff? Well, I read it in a book. It's a book called Dickens and Staplehurst, a biography of a rail crash. Who wrote it? Oh, I did. This has been a subject that's fascinated me. Whenever I perform the Signalman, I always talk about Staplehurst before because it had a direct influence on the writing of it. And just pre-COVID and during COVID, I was able to do a lot of research and write this book. So if you want a genuine first edition Dickens, Amazon is the place to go to. Right, so here we are at Staplehurst. All these fail-safes have been ignored. There's even another one. John Wiles, with his red flag, 540 yards up the line, should have been given explosive charges to lay, fog charges. And they would have been placed at regular distances all the way down the line, up to the breach at the bridge. He should have been given 10 of them. He was only given 2 of them. And he was told, don't put them in place unless it's foggy. It was a bright, clear day. The charges just lay on the ground, unused. So at 3:15, the bridge was lifted. There were no rails across the bridge. And up the line, suddenly, the crew began to hear a locomotive coming. The loose ends of the line started vibrating, almost singing. Wiles up the lines waved the flag in an absolute panic, but the driver had no hope. He was aware of the flash of red to his left, and he shut off steam. He heaved the regulator into reverse. He opened steam again, and the wheels span backwards to try and slow the train down with showers of sparks. But there was no way the train was going to stop. And in fact, because the driver couldn't lose enough speed to stop, that's actually what saved Charles Dickens' life on that day. Because by the time it got to the gap, the train still had so much momentum behind it, so much speed, that the locomotive, the tender, the guard's van, all managed to jump the gap. Sort of Evel Knievel-like, boom, and land on the other side. But behind that, every one of the rail cars just plunged straight down off the bridge into the river, and each one slamming onto the top of the one below. That heavy, over-engineered Victorian ironwork just crushing the carriages beneath it. As I said, the locomotive, the tender, the guard's van made it. And coupled to the back of the guard's van was the first of the first-class carriages, and it just hung. It hung down the river bank with its back just touching the river. And that was the car that Charles Dickens was riding in. He was flung into the corner with his traveling companions. But when he was sure nothing else was going to happen, he clambered out of the window. He saw one of the rail guards staggering along the track and shouted, "Please, do you know who I am?" And the guard answered, "Yes, of course we do, Mr. Dickens." "Then open the door, unlock my door, let me out, let me help." And Dickens clambered down into the riverbank and tried to assist the wounded that he found. The first man he came across had a huge, what he called moon-shaped gash across the top of his head. Dickens held him, he comforted him, he tried to cool him with water, he gave him a drink of brandy from his hip flask. But the man died in his arms. Dickens left him, he went on, he found a woman, a beautiful woman, dressed so perfectly, and Dickens remarked that there was not a mark on the dress. It was just absolutely pristine. He looked after her. He gave her a drink from his hip flask. He comforted her. He went to help someone else. When he came back, she too had died. A man come stumbling through the wreck, asking anyone if they'd seen his wife. He described her dress. She too had been killed. The Staplehurst rail disaster of the 9th of June on 1865 was one of the worst rail crashes in the history of the railroad in Britain up to that point. 10 people were killed, 50 seriously injured. And Dickens spent 2-3 hours down among the wounded helping. And it had a profound effect upon him. It's now recognized that he was suffering seriously from post-traumatic stress disorder in the aftermath. And he couldn't ride on railroads without trembling, without being terrified. Even if he was in a hansom carriage going through the streets of London and it went over a few bumps or ruts, he would grab hold of the seat, he would sweat, he would tremble, he would stare at the floor as if he was still back in that railroad carriage at Staplehurst. It terrified him. As the year went on, he began to get over the shock until a few months later, his dog, a mastiff called Turk, strayed onto a railway line and was hit by a locomotive and was killed. For Dickens, it seemed like the whole railway system was terrorizing him, was haunting him. So the next Christmas, he was writing a series of short stories for his magazine. It's called Mugby Junction. Most of them are quite light-hearted affairs of travelling on the railway system. But one, The Signalman, was much more than that. I believe it was Dickens's way of exorcising his memories of everything that he saw at Staplehurst, from the disaster that he had witnessed. Now, The Signalman is told by a narrator talking directly to the reader or to the audience. And I like to think that he himself is trying to tell his story, to share something that he witnessed with his friends or his colleagues or whoever they may be. So they are meeting in a club, a society, and Mr. Jackson is standing at a lectern to tell his story. You are his friends. This is the society. And he is going to recount his experiences of speaking to the signalman. Hello? Below there? When he heard a voice thus calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box, with a flag in his hand furled round its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But instead of looking up to where I stood, at the top of the steep cutting, nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my attention, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in that deep trench, whereas mine, high above him, was so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes before I saw him at all. Hello? Below? From looking down the line, he turned himself about, and lifting up his eyes, saw my figure high above him. Is there any path by which I might come down and speak with you? He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then, there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, changing quickly into a violent pulsation and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapor as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed and was then skimming over the landscape, I looked down again and saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as though he were waiting for me to appear. His chin was at his left hand, and that elbow rested in his right hand, drawn across his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward path, and, stepping out onto the level of the railroad and drawing nearer to him, saw him to be a dark, sallow man with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as dismal and solitary place as ever I saw. On either side, dripping wet walls of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky. The perspective, one way, merely a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon, whereas the shorter perspective, in the other direction, terminated at a gloomy red light, near to the gloomier mouth of a black tunnel in whose massive architecture was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way down to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as though I had left the natural world. Before he even stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Never even then, taking his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. Oh, well, this is a lonesome spot to occupy, but it riveted my attention looking down from up yonder. A visitor is a rarity, I hope, not an unwelcome rarity. I am far from sure of the words I used, for besides that I am never happy starting any conversation, there was something in that man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light. He looked all about it as though something were missing from it. And then he looked at me. That light, that is part of your charge, is it not? And he replied in a low voice, "Don't you know that it is?" The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit and not a man, and I have speculated since whether there might have been infection in his mind. For my part, I stepped back, but in making the action, I detected some latent fear of me in his eyes, and that put the monstrous thoughts to flight. Why? You look at me as though you have a dread of me. I was doubtful if I had seen you before. Where? He pointed to the red light he had looked at. There? But what should I be doing there? Be that as it may, I never was there. You may swear it. Yes. Yes, I think I may. I am certain that I may. His manner cleared like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do down there? Yes. That is to say, he had responsibility enough to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what were required of him. And as of actual work, manual labor, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim this lamp, to turn this iron handle now and then were all he had to do under that head. As to those many long and lonely hours of which I seem to make so much, he would only say that the routine of his life had formed itself into that shape and he had become accustomed to it. He had taught himself a language down there, if being able to know it only by sight and make his own crude ideas as to its pronunciation could be called learning it. He had worked at decimals and fractions and tried a little algebra, but he was, and had been as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it always necessary, when on duty, to remain in that channel of damp air? Could he never rise above into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended on time and circumstance. Under certain conditions, there was less on the line than at others, and the same held good for different times of the day and night. Certainly in bright weather, he did choose occasions for rising above those low shadows, but at all times being liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I might suppose. He took me into his hut, where there was a desk with an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial, face, and needles, and a little electric bell of which he had spoken. Trusting that he would excuse the remark that he was well educated, and I hoped I may say it without offense, perhaps educated above this station, He would only say that instances of such incongruity would rarely be found wanting in any large body of men. He had heard it was so in the police force, the workhouse, even in that last desperate resource, the army. And he knew it to be so more or less in any great railway staff. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sat in that little hut, he scarcely could, a student of natural philosophy and had attended lectures, but he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down and never risen again. He had no complaint to make about that. He had made his own bed. He lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. All that I have here condensed, he said in a low voice, with his grave, dark regards divided between the fire and myself. He threw in the word "sir" from time to time, and most particularly when referring to his youth, as though to request me that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him to be. He was several times interrupted by his little electric bell and had to read off messages and send replies, and on one occasion had to open the door of the hut and display a flag as a train went by and make some verbal communication with the driver. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be remarkably painstaking, vigilant, and exact, breaking off his discourse at an instant and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I should have set this man down as the safest of men to have been employed in that capacity, were it not for the circumstance that while speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen colour, looked towards the bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut against the unhealthy damp, and looked towards the red light near to the mouth of the tunnel. On both of these occasions, he came back to the fireplace with the same inexplicable air upon him that I had remarked on, but been unable to define when we were so far asunder. Said I, as I rose to take my leave of him, "Well, you almost make me feel as though I have met with a contented man." I'm afraid, I acknowledge, I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so, sir," he replied in the same low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled. I am deeply troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could, but he had said them, and I took them up. "With what? What is it that troubles you?" It is difficult to impart, sir. It is very, very difficult to speak of. If you should ever make me another visit, sir, I should try to tell you of it. Well, I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be? I go off early tomorrow morning, sir. I am on again at 10 tomorrow night. I said I would return at 11. He thanked me and walked with me to the door. "I shall show my white light, sir," he said in his peculiar low voice, "until you have found the path. When you have found it, don't call out. And when you get to the top, don't call out." There was something in his manner that made the place strike colder to me, but I said nothing more than, "Very well. And when you come down tomorrow night, sir, don't call out." Sir, allow me to ask you a question at parting.
What made you cry, hello, below there tonight?
Well, heaven knows, I cried something to that effect.
No, not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well.
All right, I admit those to be the words. I used them, no doubt, because I saw you below.
No other reason?
Well, what other reason could I possibly have?
You had no feeling they were communicated to you in any supernatural way?
No. He bade me good night, and with his white light showing, I walked by the outer rails of the down line with the disagreeable sensation of a train coming on behind me. I found the path. The mounting it was easier than the descent, and I returned to my inn without adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I set my foot on the first notch of the zigzag the following evening as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me with his white light on. I have not called out, do you see? May I speak with you now?
By all means, sir.
Well, good night then. Here is my hand.
Oh, and good night, sir. And here is mine.
And with that, we walked side by side into the hut, shut the door, and took our seats beside the fire.
I have made up my mind, sir,
he began, as soon as we were seated and speaking in a tone but little more than a whisper,
that you shall not have to ask me twice what it is that troubles me. I took you for somebody else last night. That troubles me.
That mistake?
No. No, that somebody else.
Who is it?
I don't know.
But, like me,
I don't know. I never saw the face, you see. The left arm is always held across the face, and the right arm is waved, violently waved, this way.
I followed the action with my eyes. It was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence.
For God's sake, clear the way! One moonlit night, sir, I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry,
"Hello! Below there!"
I hurried to the door and looked out, and there, standing near to the red light at the mouth of the tunnel, was this somebody else waving as I just now showed you. Its voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it called again, "Hello! Look out, below!" I caught my lamp, I turned it to red, I ran towards him, crying, "What is the matter? What has happened? Where?" It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel, sir. I ran up at it. As I came close, I wondered at its keeping its sleeve across its face. I had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away. And it was gone.
Into the tunnel?
No, I ran into the tunnel some 500 yards. I stopped, I held my lantern up. I saw the figures of the measured distances. I saw the wet stains stealing down the wall and trickling through the arch. I ran out again faster than I ran in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of that place upon me. I looked all around the red light with my lamp. I climbed the ladder to the gallery atop it. I came back down. I came in here. I sent a message both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything the matter? And the message came back, both ways, all clear.
Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing down my spine, I showed him how this figure must have been a deception of his sense of sight, how such figures, originating from disease to the delicate nerves that minister to the functions of the eye, were well known among patients. And as to an imaginary cry, do but listen to the wind in this unnatural valley, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he said, when we had sat listening a while.
After all, I should know something about the wind in the wires. Me, who sits here so many winter's nights alone and watching. But if I may beg, sir, I have not yet finished.
I asked his pardon, and touching my arm with his hand, he added these words.
Within 6 hours of the appearance, the memorable accident on this line occurred. Within 10 hours, the dead and the wounded were carried on through the tunnel over the very spots where the figure had stood.
A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. Well, there is no doubt. This is a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress upon your mind. But it cannot be questioned that remarkable coincidences do continually occur. They must be taken into account when dealing with such matters. Although, I do admit, men of common sense rarely take note of coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life. He again begged to remark that he had not yet finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions.
This was just a year ago. 6, 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and the shock. When, early one morning, just at daybreak, I, standing at the door, looked towards the red light at the tunnel, and the figure was there again.
He stopped and looked fixedly at me. Did it call out?
No. It was silent.
Did it wave its arm?
No. It leant against the shaft of the danger light with its hands before its face. This way.
Again, I followed the action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen the attitude myself in stone figures on tombs. Did you run up to it?
No, I came back in here. I sat down partly to collect my thoughts, but partly because it had turned me faint. And when I returned to the door, the daylight was above me, and the ghost was gone.
But nothing happened. Nothing came of this. He touched my arm twice or thrice with his forefinger, giving a ghastly nod each time.
That very day, sir, as a train came out of the tunnel, I saw through the windows of one of the carriages on my side a terrible confusion of heads and hands, and something waved. I saw it in time to signal the driver stop. Well, he shut off and put on the brakes, but the train drifted past this place 150 yards or more. I ran up after it, and as I came alongside, I heard terrible cries and screams, sir. A beautiful young woman had died instantaneously in one of the compartments. She was brought in here, laid on this floor between us.
Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back and looked from the boards to which he pointed, to himself.
True, sir. All true. Precisely as it happened, so I tell you.
I could think of nothing of purpose to say. My mouth was dry. The wind in the wires took up the story in a long, lamenting wail.
And now, sir, mark this and see how my mind is troubled. The ghost came back a week ago. It has been there ever since, now and again, in fits and starts.
That's the light?
At the danger light.
What does it appear to do?" And he repeated, if possible with greater passion and vehemence, the former gesticulation of, "For God's sake, clear the way." I have no ease nor rest for it, sir. It calls to me minutes together in an agonized voice. "Hello, below, look out, look out." It waves its arm at me. It rings my bell. I caught at that. Wait. Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here, and you went out to the door? Yes, twice. Well, my good fellow, see how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on that bell. My ears were open to that bell. And if I am a living man, it did not ring at those times, or at any other time, except in the natural course of the physical things with the station communicating with you. No, sir, I've never yet made a mistake as to that. I've never confused a spectre's ring with a man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration deep within the bell, which is derived from nothing else. I have never asserted it stirs to the eye. I do not wonder you fail to hear it. But I heard it. And did the ghost seem to be there when you looked out? It was there. Both times? Both times. Will you come to the door with me now and see if it is there? He bit his underlip as though he was somewhat unwilling, but he walked with me to the door. I opened it and stood on the step, and he stood in the doorway. There was the gloomy red light. There was the barbarous black tunnel. There were the high stone wet walls, and there was a narrow strip of stars above. Do you see it? I observed his face closely. His eyes were strained and prominent, but perhaps no more so than mine had been when I had addressed them to the same spot. No. No, it is not there. Agreed. We came back into the hut and shut the door, and I was thinking how best I might improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the story in so matter-of-course a manner, and so assuming there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. So, sir, by this time you will fully understand what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean? I'm not certain I do understand. What is it warning me against? What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will occur. It's not to be doubted this third time after what has gone before, but surely this is a mere cruel haunting of me. For what can I do? He took his handkerchief out and wiped the spots from his heated forehead. If I telegraph either side, or both, I can give no reason for it. He went on, wiping the palms of his hands. They would think I was mad. It would do no good. I should get into trouble. This is how it would work. Message, danger, take care. Answer, what danger? Where? Message, I don't know, but for God's sake, take care. They would displace me, sir. What else could they do? His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. If, when it first stood at the danger light, why could it not have told me where the accident was to happen if it had to happen, or how it could have been averted if it could have been averted? When on its second coming it hid its face, why not tell me she is going to die, let them keep her at home? If it came those 2 times to show me its warnings were true, to prepare me for a third, then why not speak plainly to me now? And me, a mere poor signalman in his solitary post. Why not go to someone with the credit to be believed and the power to act? When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the man's sake and for the public safety, what I must do for the time was to compose his mind. So,
setting aside any question of reality or unreality between us, I showed him how any man who thoroughly discharged his duty must do well. And it should be his comfort that he understood his duty, although he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort, I succeeded far greater than making any attempt to reason him out of his convictions, and he became calm. The occupations incidental to his post, as the night wore on, began to make greater demands upon his time, and I left him at 2:00 in the morning. I had offered to remain there through the night, but he would not hear of it. That, as I mounted the path, I more than once looked back at the red light. That I did not like that red light. That I should have slept but poorly had my bed been under it, I see no reason to conceal here. That I did not like the twin circumstances of the accident and the young lady's death, I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran foremost in my thoughts was the consideration, how should I act, having become the recipient of this disclosure? I had proved the man to be painstaking, vigilant, and exact, but how much longer might he remain so in this state? And although in a subordinate position, still he held an important trust. And would I, for example, care to stake my life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision? Unable to shake the fear that there would be something treacherous in my repeating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without first speaking plainly with him and representing a middle path, I ultimately offered to accompany him, keeping his secret at present, to the finest medical practitioner that could be heard of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come about the following evening, he had apprised me. He would be off a little after sunrise, and on again a little after sunset. I appointed to return accordingly. The following evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to fully enjoy it. The sun had not yet set as I traversed the field path near to the top of the steep cutting. I would extend my walk by an hour, I told myself. Half an hour on, half an hour back, and then it would be time to go to my signalman's hut. Before pursuing my stroll, I set foot to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when I saw, standing at the mouth of the tunnel, the appearance of a man with his arm drawn across his face and his right arm waving. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment when I saw that the appearance of a man was a man indeed, and there was a small group of other men standing at some short distance to whom he appeared to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The light had not yet been lit, and at its base, a small hut, entirely new to me, had been made with wooden supports and a tarpaulin. It looked no larger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing, self-reproaching fear that some fatal mischief had come of my leaving the fellow there alone and causing nobody to be sent and overlook what he did, I made my way down the zigzag with all the haste I could. What has happened here? Signalman. Killed this morning. What? Not the man who belongs to that hut. Yes, sir. Not the man I know. If you know him, sir, said the fellow who spoke on behalf of the others, solemnly uncovering his head and lifting a corner of the tarpaulin, you will recognize him, for his face
is quite composed. Well, how did this happen? How did this happen? I asked one to another as the hut was closed in again. Engine cut him down, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he wasn't clear of the outer rail, and the engine cut him down. It was just at daybreak. He had struck the light and had his own lamp in his hand. As the train came out of the tunnel, he had his back to her, and she cut him down. This fellow was driving. He was showing us how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom. The man who wore a rough black dress resumed his place at the mouth of the tunnel. As I came round the curve in the tunnel, sir, I see him at the end like I see him down a perspective glass. It was too late to shut off speed, and I knew him to be very careful, you see, sir. Well, since he took no heed of the whistle, I shut it off, and I called to him. I called as loudly as I could, sir. What did you say?
Oh, I cried out, hello, below, look out, for God's sake, clear the way. I started. Sir, it was a terrible time. I shouted to the very last, sir. I put this arm before my eyes so as not to see, and I waved this arm until the end, but it was no use, sir.
Without prolonging the narrative by dwelling on any one of its curious circumstances more than any other, I should, in closing, like to point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver contained not only the words the poor signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also those that I, not he, had attached, and then only in my imagination, to the gesticulation he had imitated. Now, of course, Charles Dickens did not perish in the Staplehurst rail disaster of 1865, which took place in the afternoon on the 9th of June. He lived a further 5 years, drawing his final breath in 1870 in the afternoon of the 9th of June. That is a ghost story. Thank you. Thank you. A few years ago, I was performing this piece on a little railway line in the middle of Wales. It was a railway line that was based on the old slate trains that would take the slate from the mountains down to the quayside. And the organisers had asked me to perform it in a station halfway up the mountain. And the lovely idea was all the passengers would get on the train at the quayside. They'd all come up the mountain to the station. I performed another piece in the first half, then we had dinner, and then, as darkness fell, I performed the Signalman. And when it was finished, they all got back on the train to go back down the mountain, back to the quayside. And because they were old slate trains, there was no electricity on board, there were no lights. And I thought, having had such a fun evening with them, it might be nice to say goodbye. So I stood on a footbridge that went over the line. And as they went off, I just waved to them. And they've never invited me back since. Anyway, that's the end of the first half. When we come back to the second half, I'm going to perform another short story from the magazine All Year Round, which you have probably never heard of because nobody has. But it's one of my favorite pieces to perform. It is called Dr. Marigold. I think you will enjoy meeting him. So I shall see you in 10 or 15 minutes, and I shall introduce you to Dr. Marigold. Thank you.
We're about to resume. Please notice the massive set change. Please welcome back Gerald Dickens with Dr. Marigold.
Thank you. So welcome back. I said just before the intermission that Dr. Marigold is probably a story you've never heard of in your life. And if you haven't, that's fine, because very few people have. But in Dickens's own day, it was incredibly popular. Now, he wrote it for all the year round, the 1865 Christmas edition. But I believe he actually wrote it not as a piece of prose to be read, but a script to be performed. He was engaged in his reading tours at that time, touring throughout Great Britain, and would soon be traveling to America to perform as well. And Marigold was immediately put in to his repertoire. And it became one of the most popular pieces. People would flock to see it. They loved this story. Now, it was very different in tone to his usual readings. Most of his readings were lifted from a novel. So he would therefore stand on the stage, act as a narrator, and then would have the opportunity to do lots of other voices and expressions and things as the plot unfolded. But Marigold is different. Marigold is just told by a single character talking directly to his audience. When Charles Dickens performed it, he would walk onto the stage, he would make a short introduction, just as I have, and then he would say these words. And now I shall let Dr. Marigold address you in his own words. I am a cheapjack. Now, my own father's name was Willem Marigold. It was in his lifetime supposed by some that his name was William, but no, he always said it were Willem. I was born on the Queen's Highway. Well, it was the King's at the time, of course. A doctor was fetched to my own mother by my own father when it took place on a common. And in consequence of his being a very kind gentleman and accepting no fee but a tea tray, I was named Doctor, out of gratitude and compliment to him. So there you have me, Dr. Marigold. Now, the doctor, having accepted a tea tray, you'll guess that my father was a cheapjack before me, and you're right, he was. He'd been a lovely one in his lifetime at the cheapjack work, my father. Now, I mean to go down to my grave declaring that of all the callings ill-used in Great Britain, the cheapjack calling is the worst used. Why ain't we a profession? Why ain't we endowed with privileges? Why are we forced to take out an hawker's licence when no such thing is expected of the political hawkers? Where's the difference betwixt us? Save we are cheapjacks and they are dearjacks. I don't see any difference. Save what's in our favour. For look here, right? Say it's election time, right? I'm on the footboard of my cart on a Saturday night and I put up a general miscellaneous lot. Now then, what do I say? I say, now here, my free and independent voters, I'm going to give you such a chance as you never had in all your born days, nor yet the days preceding. Now, here's what I'm going to do for you. Here's a pair of razors that will shave you closer than the Border Guardians. There's a flat iron worth its weight in gold. There's a frying pan, artificially flavoured with essence of beefsteak. To that extent, you've only for the rest of your lives got to fry bread and drip it in, and there you are, replete with animal food. Here is a genuine chronometer watch in such a solid silver case that you may knock at the door with it when you come home late from a social meeting, rouse your wife and family, and save you knock her up for the postman. Here is a dozen dinner plates on which you, madam, may play cymbals to charm that baby when he's fractious. Here, stop. I'll give you another article. I'll give you that, and that's a rolling pin. And if the baby can get it into his mouth and rub its gums once with it when it's coming through, they'll come through double with a fit of laughter equal to being tickled. One more article, and that is a looking glass in which you may see how ugly you look when you don't bid. Now then, what do you say for this lot? £1? No, can't afford it. 10 shillings? You won't walk the tally, man. Look, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to heap them all on the footboard of the cart next to me. There they are. There's the razors and the flat iron and the frying pan, the chronometer watch, there's the dinner plates, the rolling pin and the looking glass. All away for 4 shillings, 4 shillings, 4 shillings, 4 shillings, and I'll give you 6pence for your trouble. That's me, the cheapjack. But on the Monday morning, in the same marketplace, comes the dearjack on the hustings. That's his card. Now, what does he say? He says,
Now here, my free and independent voters, I'm going to give you such a... He begins just the same as me, you see, as you ever had in all your born days, and that is the chance of sending myself to Parliament. Now here's what I'm going to do for you. Here's the interests of this most magnificent town, promoted above all the rest of civilised and uncivilised society. Here is your railways carried and your neighbours' railways jockeyed. Here's all your sons in the post office. Here's Britannia smiling on you. Here's the eyes of Europe on you. Repletion of animal food, golden cornfields, gladsome homesteads, rounds of applause from your own heart, all in one lot, and that is myself. So will you take me as I stand? You won't. Very well, I'll tell you what I'll do. You tell me what you want and you shall have it. Church rates, abolition of church rates, more malt tax, no malt tax, universal education to the highest degree, universal ignorance to the lowest, total abolition of flogging in the army, or a dozen for every private once a month all round, wrongs of men, rights of women. You just say which it shall be, take them or leave them, and I'm of your opinion altogether. So now will you take me? Still not, all right. Because you are such free and independent voters, and this is such a noble and enlightened constituency, and I am so very ambitious of the honour of being elected as your member, which is by far the highest heights to which the wings of the human mind can soar. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll throw in all the public houses in this most magnificent town in for nothing. Will that please you? Still no, all right. Before I put the horse in the cart and ride away and make the offer to the next most magnificent town that can be discovered, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll count out £2,000 on the footboard of my cart to be dropped in the streets of this most magnificent town to be picked up by them that can. Not enough? All right, this is as high as I'm going to go. I'll make it 2,500. Still no. All right, missus, put the horse in the... Ah, wait a minute. I shouldn't like to turn my back on you, not neither for a trifle. I'll make it £2,750. There, £2,750 to be dropped in the streets of this most magnificent town. Come, you won't do better. You might do a great deal worse. What? You'll take it? Sold again. Got the seat. You know what? I courted my wife from the footboard of that cart. I did indeed. She were a Suffolk young woman. It were in Ipswich Marketplace, just opposite the corn chandler's shop there. And I'd noticed her the last Saturday night there was, appreciating highly. And I took to her, and I says to myself, if not already disposed of, I'll have that lot. So, the next Saturday that come, I pitch my cart in exactly the same pitch, and I'm in very high feather indeed. I'm getting the goods off briskly, getting them all laughing, you know, until at last I take an article from my waistcoat pocket, and looking up to where she was, I says, now, my beautiful English maidens, is another article, the final article of this evening's sale, which I offer only to you, the lovely Suffolk dumplings boiling over with beauty, and I won't take a bid of £1,000 for this from any man alive. Now then, what is it? Well, it's solid gold, and it ain't broken, even though there's an hole in the middle of it. It's stronger than any fetter that was ever forged, though it's smaller than any fingers on my set of 10. What else is it? It's a man trap. Handcuffs, parish stocks and a leg lock, all in gold and all in one. What else is it? It's a wedding ring. Now then, I tell you what I'm going to do with this lot. I'm not going to offer this lot for sale, but I'm going to have it handed up to the next of you beauties that laughs. And when I call on her tomorrow morning, 9:30, as the chimes go, I'll take her for a walk and I'll put up the banns. Well, she laughs. She gets the ring handed up to her. And when I calls on her the next morning, she says, oh, dear me, it's never you. You never means it. It's ever me, says I, and I am ever yours. And yes, I ever means it. So we got married. Having been put up 3 times, which, by the by, is quite in the Cheap Jack way again, and shows once more how Cheap Jack customs pervade society. She wasn't a bad wife, but she had a temper. If she could have parted with that one article at a sacrifice, I wouldn't have swapped her away for any woman in England. Not that I ever did swap her away, mind, for we lived together until she died, and that were 13 year. Now, my lords, ladies, and gentlefolk all, I'm going to let you into a secret. 13 year of temper in a palace. Well, that might try the worst of you. 13 year of temper in a cart. That would try the best of you. I mean, you kept so very close to it in a cart. There's thousands of couples among you getting on like sweet oil upon a whetstone in houses 5 and 6 pairs of stairs high that would go to divorce court in a cart. Whether it's the jolting that makes it worse, don't undertake to decide. But it rolls upon you, it clings to you. Violence in a cart is so violent. Aggravation in a cart is so aggravating. Oh, we might have had such a pleasant life. A roomy cart, all the large goods hung outside, the bed slung beneath it when on the road. An iron pot and a kettle, a fireplace for the cold weather, a chimney for the smoke, a hanging shelf and a cupboard, a dog and a horse. You pull off onto a bit of turf in a green lane or by the roadside, you hobble your old horse, you set him to grazing, you make your fire in the ashes of the last visitor, you cook your stew, and you wouldn't call the Emperor of France your father. But have a temper in a cart, flinging language and the hardest goods in stock at you. Well, where are you then? You put a name to your feelings. My dog knew as well as me when she was on the turn before I did. Before she broke out, he would give an howl and bolt. How he knew it was beyond me, but the sure and certain knowledge of it would wake him from the sound of sleep. He would give an howl and he would bolt. Sometimes I wished I was in. The worst of it was, we had a little daughter born to us. Now, I love children with all my heart, but when she was in her furies, she beat that child. And this got to be so shocking as a little girl got to be 4 or 5 years old that many's the time I went walking on at the old horse's head with my whip over my shoulder, crying and sobbing worse than ever little Sophie did, for what could I do to prevent it without it coming to a fight? Such a thing is not to be tried in a cart without it coming to a fight. It's the very size and character of a cart to bring it to a fight. And then the little child will get worse frightened than before, not to mention worse hurt general. And then my wife would complain to the next people we lighted on, and word would go about, here's that wretch of a cheapjack. He's been a-beating his wife. Little Sophie, she was such a brave child. She grew to be quite fond of her poor father, though he could do so little to help her. She had a wonderful quantity of shining dark hair, all curly natural about her face. And looking back, it's a wonder I didn't go tearing mad when I used to see her mother catch her by this hair, pull her down by it and beat her. And yet, in all other respects, she took wonderful care of her. Her clothes were always neat and clean. She never tired of working at them like. Well, such is the inconsistency of things, I suppose. Ours being down in the marsh country in unhealthy weather, I consider it to be the reason that Sophie took bad low fever. But however she took it, once she got it, she turned away from her mother forevermore. Nothing would induce her to be touched by her mother's hand, and she would cry, no, 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 when it was offered at, and hide her face and cling me tight around the neck. The cheapjack business was worse than ever I'd known it. What with one thing, what with another, not to mention the coming of the railroads, which will cut it all to pieces in the end, I expect. But one night I couldn't get Sophie to lie down or even to leave go of me. And indeed, I didn't have the heart to try. So I stepped out onto the footboard of that cart with her clinging round my neck. They all set up a laugh when they see us, and one chuckle-headed Joskin that I hated for it made the bidding. "Here, twopence for her," he said. "Now, my country boobies," said I, feeling as if my heart were a heavy weight on the end of a broken sash line. "You tell me what you want tonight, and you shall have it. But first, do you want to know why I've got this child clinging around my shoulder? You don't? Well, then I'll tell you. She belongs to the fairies. She's a fortune teller. She can tell me all about you in a whisper. She can put me up as to whether you're going to take a lot or leave it. For example, you want a saw? No, she says, you're too clumsy to use one. Your well-known awkwardness would make you manslaughter. Now then, I'm going to ask her what you do want." And then, stroking her face, I said, "Your head burns so. I'm afraid it hurts you bad." And with her heavy eyes closed, she said, "Just a little, Father." "Oh," she says, "it's a memorandum book you want. Then why didn't you say so? Here it is, look, 200 superfine, not press YO pages, ready rule for your expenses. There's an everlasting pencil to write them down with. There's a double-bladed penknife to scratch them out with. There's a book of tables to calculate your income with. There's a camp stool so you may sit down when you put your mind to it. And there is an umbrella so you may keep the moon off when you put your mind to it on a pitch dark night. Now then, I'm not going to ask you how much for this lot, but how little. How little do you want to pay? Now don't be afraid to name the figure. Remember, my little fortune teller knows already." And then, making believe to whisper, I kissed her and she kissed me. "Oh," she says, "you're thinking as little as 3 and threepence. 3 and threepence? I wouldn't have believed it even if you and she'd told me. 3 and threepence? Why, there's a book of tables in that lot to calculate your income up to 40,000 a year. With an income of 40,000 a year, you begrudge 3 and sixpence. Well, I'll tell you what, I so despise that threepence, I'm going to say 3 shillings. 3 shillings, 3 shillings, 3 shillings. There, sold to the gentleman, pass him forward." Well, as there'd been no bid at all, everybody looked around and grinned at everybody else, and I took the chance to look at Sophie and ask her if she felt faint or giddy. "Just a little, Father, but it will soon all be over." And then, looking away from her pretty patient eyes, which were open now and seeing nothing but smiles across my lighted grease spot, I went on again in my cheapjack style. "Where's the butcher?" My sorrowful eye had caught sight of a fat young butcher on the outside of the crowd, and everybody passed the blushing butcher to the front, and a roar went up, and he felt obliged to put his hand in his pocket and take the lot. Well, the party so picked out in general does feel obliged to take the lot. And then we had another lot, the counterpart of that one, and it sold 6pence cheaper, which is always very much enjoyed. And then we had the ladies' lot. The teapot, the tea caddy, the glass sugar basin, half a dozen teaspoons and a caudle cup. And all the time I was making similar excuses to have a look or two or a word or two with little Sophie. And it was when the second ladies' lot was holding them enchained that I felt her raise herself on my shoulder. "What's the matter? What troubles you?" "Nothing troubles me, Father. But don't I see a churchyard across the street?" "Yes." "Then kiss me. Twice, dear Father. And lay me down on that churchyard grass so soft and green." I staggered back into the cart with her head slumped down upon my shoulder, and I says to her mother, "Quick, shut that door. Don't let them laughing people see." "What's the matter?" she says. "Oh, woman, you will never catch Sophie by her hair again, for she has flown away from you." Perhaps they was harsher words than I meant them to be. From that day on, she took to brooding. She would sit in the cart or walk alongside it hours at a stretch with her arms folded. And when her furies did take her, which was rather seldom with them before, they took her in a different way. And she beat herself to that extent that I was forced to hold her. And she got none the better for a little drink now and then. So sad our lives went on. Until late one summer's afternoon, as we were coming back into Exeter from the far west of England, we saw a child being beaten in a cruel manner. And the child cried out, "No, don't beat me, mother, mother, mother." And then my wife stopped up her ears and ran away like a wild thing. The next day, she was found in the river. Well, me and my dog were the only company in the cart now, and he learned to give a short bark when they wouldn't bid, and another, and a nod of the head when I said, "Who said half a crown? Are you the gentleman, sir, that said half a crown?" Woof! Yeah. He attained a great height of popularity, and I believed talked himself entirely out of his own head to growl at any person in the crowd who bid as low as sixpence. But he got to be well on in years, you know, and one night when I was in York, convulsing him with the spectacles, he took on a convulsion on the footboard next to me, and, well, you know, it finished him. So, being of a natural tender turn, I had dreadful feelings of loneliness come on my heart of this. Well, I conquered them at selling times, of course, having a reputation to keep, not to mention keeping myself, but they got me down in private. They rolled upon me. And it was under these circumstances that I come acquainted with a giant who, when on show, featured as a Roman. He was a very languid young man, which I attribute to the distance betwixt his extremities. He had weak eyes and weak knees, and you couldn't look at him without thinking there was altogether too much of him, both for his mind and his joints. He was called Rinaldo di Velasco, his name being Pickleson. Now this giant, otherwise Pickleson, mentions to me under the seal of confidence that beyond his being a burden to himself, his life is made a burden to him by the cruelty of his master to a stepdaughter who was deaf and dumb. Her mother was dead, she had no living soul to take her part, and she only travelled with his master's caravan because there was nowhere to leave her. And this giant, also Pickleson, did go so far as to tell me that he believed his master had often tried to lose her. Well, when he tells me this, and also she had a quantity of dark hair and was often pulled down by it and beaten, well, you can imagine. I could scarcely see that giant through what stood in my eyes. His master's name was Mim, a very horse man I knew him to speak to. And I went to that fair as a mere civilian. Left my cart outside the town, and I was looking around the back of the vans while the performing was going on, until at last I found, sat dozing against a muddy cartwheel, this little girl who was deaf and dumb. At the first look, I might have thought she'd escaped from the wild beast show. But at the second, I thought better of her, and thought if she was more cared for, more kindly used, she'd be just like my own daughter. She was the same age as my daughter would have been if her head had not dropped down upon my shoulder on that unhappy night. Well, I goes to speak to Mim confidential when he's banging the gong outside betwixt two lots of Pickles and Publics, and I puts it to him this way. I says, "She weighs heavy on your hands. What'll you take for her?" Now, Mim was a most ferocious swearer. So, setting aside that part of his reply, which was by far the longest part, his reply was, "A pair of braces. I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to go back to my cart, fetch you a dozen pair of the Primus braces, and then to take her away." Says Mim, still ferocious. "I'll believe it when I see it and not before." I makes all the haste I could, lest she changed his mind, and the bargain was settled. It was happy times for Sophie and me when we went together in the cart. Oh yeah. I at once gave her the name of Sophie to ever put her towards me in the attitude of my own daughter. And we soon begin to understand one another when, through the gracious of the heavens, she knew I meant true and kind by her. She soon became wonderful fond of me. You have no idea what it is to have anybody wonderful fond of you, unless you've been got down and rolled on by them feelings of loneliness, as I mentioned, have once got the better of me. You'd have laughed, or the reverse, it's according to your disposition, if you could have seen me trying to teach her. At first, I was helped by, never guess what, milestones. I had a box of alphabets in the cart, all the letters carved separate on bits of bone like, and say we was going to Windsor. Well, I'll give her them letters in that order. And at the very next milestone, I get down and I show him them same letters in that same order, and I point towards the abode of royalty. Another time, I give her C, A, R, T, and I chalk the same upon the cart. Another time, I give her D, O, C, T, O, R, M, A, R, I, G, O, L, D, and hung the corresponding inscription outside my waistcoat. Well, people who met us might laugh and point a bit, but what did I care if she caught the idea? And she did catch it by long patience and trouble. And then we did begin to get on swimmingly, I believe you. Well, at first she was a little given to consider me the cart and the cart the abode of royalty, but that soon wore off. And we had our signs too, and they was hundreds in number. And sometimes she would sit looking at me, considering hard what she wanted to explain, something afresh, what she wanted to communicate. And then she was, or I thought she was, what does that signify? So like my own daughter with them years added to her, that I half believed it was her, come back to tell me where she'd been to up in the sky and what she'd seen since her head dropped on my shoulder on that unfortunate night. She had a pretty face, and now all was in order and there was no one to pull at that dark curls. There was something quite touching in her looks that made the cart most quiet and peaceful, though not at all melancholy. In the Cheap Jack patter, we usually sound it lemon jolly. Yeah, and that usually gets a laugh. The way she learned to understand any look of mine was truly surprising. When I sold of a night, she would sit inside the cart, unseen by them outside. And when I looked in, she would look into my eyes and then give me the precise article or articles I wanted. And then she would smile at me and clap her hands and laugh for love and joy. And as for me, seeing her so bright, remembering what she was when I first lighted on her, starved, ragged, beaten, dozing against that muddy cartwheel, well, it gave my heart such a lift that I attained a greater height of popularity than ever before. And I put Pickleson down under the name of Mim's Travelling Giant, otherwise Pickleson, for a £5 note in my will. Well, this happiness went on in the cart until she was 17 years old, by which time I began to feel not satisfied that I'd done my old duty by her, that she needed better teaching than I could give her. Well, it drew a great many tears on both sides when I commenced explaining my views to her, but what is right, and you can't neither by tears nor laughter do away with its true nature. So, one day, I takes her by the hand and we goes together to the deaf and dumb establishment in London. And when the gentleman comes to see us, I says, "Now look here, I am nothing but a rough cheap jack in an old waistcoat, but I've been laying aside for a rainy day, notwithstanding. This is my only daughter, adopted, and I want her to be taught as much as can be taught with as little separation as possible, and I'm good to put the money down." The gentleman smiled. "But first, I must know what she has learnt already. How do you communicate with her? So we shows him, and Sophie draws pictures and writes down the names of some things in printed letters, and Sophie and me have a sprightly conversation about a little story in a book that the gentleman had showed her and what she'd been able to read. Well, this is extraordinary, says the gentleman. Do you mean to tell me you have been her only teacher? I have been her only teacher, sir. Besides herself. Well then, says the gentleman, and more acceptable words was never spoken to me. You are a good fellow and a clever fellow. This he makes known to Sophie, who runs to him, holds her hands up and claps them in joy and cries with love and happiness. Marigold, what more do you want your adopted daughter to know? Well, sir, I want her, considering her deprivations, to be cut off from the world as little as can be, and therefore to be able to read whatever is written with perfect ease and pleasure. My good fellow, says the gentleman, opening his eyes wide, I can scarcely do that myself. I takes his words, give him a laugh, knowing how flat you fall without them, and I mended my words accordingly. Marigold, can you part with her for 2 years? To do her that good? Yes. There is another question, said the gentleman, looking over to where she was standing. Can she part with you for 2 years? Well, I don't know if that was harder, for the other was harder for me, but it was harder to get over. But at last she was pacified to it, and the separation betwixt us was settled. And how it cut us both up when it took place of an evening and I left her at the door, I don't tell. But I do know I could never pass that same establishment again without a heartache or a swelling in my throat, and I couldn't put you up the best of lots in sight of it with my usual spirit. But the loneliness that followed in the cart, it was not the old loneliness, because there was a term put to it, however long, to look forward to. And I could always think, when I was anyways down, that she belonged to me and I belonged to her. Now, always preparing for her coming back. After a few months, I bought myself a new cart. Now, what do you think I plan to do with that? Well, I shall tell you. I plan to have it fitted out with shelves and books for her reading, and have a little table where I could sit and watch her read and think that I'd been her first teacher. Not hurrying over the job, I had the fittings knocked together in contriving ways, always under my inspection. And here was her bed in a little berth with a curtain, and there was her reading table, and there was her writing desk, and elsewhere were her books in rows upon rows. Pictures, no pictures, bindings, no bindings, gilt-edged and plain, just as I could pick them up for her in lots up and down the country. And when I got just about as many books as that cart would neatly hold, a new idea came into my head, which, as it happened, saw me over the 2-year stile. Now, without being an avaricious man, I like to be the owner of things. For example, I shouldn't like to go into partnership with the cheap jack cart with yourself. Well, it's not I don't trust you. It's just I'd rather know it was mine, and no doubt you'd rather know it was yours. Yeah? Well, a kind of thought, a kind of jealousy come into my head when looking at the backs of all those books. I considered that they'd all been read by somebody else before they'd been read by her. It took away from her being the owner of them, like. And I thinks, why can't I have a new book express made just for her that she will be the first to read? Oh, it pleased me, that thought did, and so formed a resolution. Now, how about the title? How did I hammer that hot iron into shape? Well, this way. One of the greatest difficulties we ever had between us was the question why I come to be called Doctor and yet was no doctor. We first discovered the trouble we'd fallen into one day when she asked me to prescribe to her. when she still believed me to be a doctor in the medical point of view. Well, I think if I can give this book the name of my prescriptions, and she catches the idea that my only prescriptions are for her entertainment and interest, to make her laugh in a happy way, to make her cry in a happy way, it will be a delightful proof that we have got over our difficulty. Oh, it fell out to absolute perfection. But let me not anticipate. I take that phrase from any number of the romances I bought for her. I never opened a single one, and I've opened a great many, without the romancer saying, but let me not anticipate. In which case, I wonder why he did anticipate and who put him up to it in the first place. Anyway, as I say, let me not anticipate. This same book took up all my spare time, and the 2 years' time was gone as all the other time has gone before it. And where it's gone to, who knows? The new cart was finished, yellow on the outside, relieved with vermilion and brass fittings. I put the old horse in it, got a new one and a boy for the cheapjack cart, and I cleaned myself up and went to London to fetch her. When the gentleman comes to see me, he gives me his hand hearty. Marigold, he says, I am very glad to see you. And yet, sir, you cannot be as glad to see me as I am to see you. The time has appeared so long, has it, Marigold? Well, I shouldn't say that, sir, considering its real length. Well, what a good start, my fine fellow. I should think it was. Grown. Such a woman. Standing so pretty, intelligent, expressive by the door. I knew at once she must be just like my own daughter, else I should never have known her. You are affected, Marigold. No. No, I think I'm just a rough cheapjack in an old waistcoat. No. I think it was you who rescued her from misery and degradation, who brought her into communication with her own kind. But look, why are we talking here when we can communicate so well with her? Come on, Marigold, address her in your own way. No. No. I'm just a rough cheapjack. And she stands so graceful and so quiet by the door. Come, try your own sign. They got it up on purpose to please me. So when I give her the sign, she runs to me, falls onto her knees and holds up her hands. And when I lift her up and she clings me round the neck and hides her face, oh, I don't know what a fool I didn't make of myself. Until we all three settle down into talking without words, as if something soft had settled over the whole world for us. Every item of my plan was crowned with success. Our reunited life was everything we dreamed it to be. Content and happiness went with us as the wheels of the two carts went round, and the same stopped with us when the wheels of the two carts stopped. I was pleased and proud as a pug dog with its muzzle black leaded for an evening party and its tail extra curled by machinery. But I had left something out of my calculations. We were in Lancaster, and I'd done 2 nights of more than fair average business in the open square there. Now, Mim's travelling giant, otherwise Pickleson, was also trying it on in the town, which suited my purpose, because I wanted a word with him, which was this. Pickleson, I says, owing much happiness to you, I put you down for a £5 note in my will. However, here is £4.10 down, which might equally suit your purpose, and so let us conclude that transaction. But what was to the present point of the remarks of Mim's travelling giant, otherwise Pickleson, was these. Dr. Marigold. I'll give his voice without a hope of conveying its feebleness. Dr. Marigold, who is the strange young The man who hangs about your carts at night. Strange young man, I gives him, thinking he means her and that his languid circulation has dropped a syllable. Dr. Marigold, he says, with a pathos guaranteed to draw a tear from even a manly eye. Dr. Marigold, I may be weak, but not so weak as I do not know my own words. I repeat them. Strange young man. Now it turns out that this giant was forced to stretch his legs, well, not that they needed it, when he couldn't be seen for nothing, to wit in the dead of night and towards daybreak. And he had twice seen, loitering round my cart in that same town of Lancaster, where we'd only been 2 nights, this strange young man. Well, it rather put me out of sorts, that did. But I made light of it to Pickleson. I took my leave of Pickleson. And next morning, I looked out for this young man. And what's more, I saw him. He was well looking, well dressed, and he loitered very nigh my cart, so like he was looking after him. And then towards daybreak, he turned and he walked away. Well, I sent a hail after him, but he never turned, showed any signs of being leastways interested. Well, within an hour or 2, we left Lancaster, headed for Carlisle. And on the following morning, I looked out for the young man again, but he wasn't there. The next morning, I looked out once more, and I saw him again. I sent another hail after him. And as before, he showed no signs of being in any ways interested or disturbed. And that put a thought into my head. And acting on it, I watched him in different times, different manners, not necessary to go into. Until at last, I discovered that this young man was deaf and dumb. Well, that rather put me out of sorts, that did, because I knew that part of that establishment where she'd been was given over to young men, some of them well off. And I thinks, if she favours this young man, well, where does that leave me? Where does that leave for everything I've worked for? Hoping I confess to the selfishness that she might not favour him. I set myself out to find out. Until one day, I was by accident present at a meeting between them in the open air, watching on from behind a fir tree. It was a moving meeting for all 3 parties involved. I knew every word that passed between them. I listened with my eyes, which had come to be as quick and clear with the conversation of deaf and dumb folk as my ears with the talk of those that can speak. He was going to China to be a clerk in a merchant's house, as his father had been before him. And he was in circumstances to take a wife. He wanted her to marry him and go with him. No, she said. She couldn't. Why? Didn't she love him? Oh, yes. She loved him. Dearly. Dearly. But she would never disappoint her good, noble, generous, kind, and I don't know what else, father, meaning me, the rough cheapjack in the old waistcoat, and she wouldn't disappoint him or leave him, though it was to break her heart. And then she wept most bitterly. And that made up my mind. Well, I've been feeling that unreasonable about her favouring this young man that I'd said to myself, it's just as well for Pickleson that he got his legacy down, for if it hadn't been for this same weak-minded giant, I might never have come to trouble my mind or vex my soul about her favouring this boy, but now I knew she loved him. Now I'd seen her weep for him. It was different. I made it up with Pickleson on the spot and thoroughly shook myself together to do what was right by all. She'd left him by this time. It'd taken me a few minutes to shake myself together. And he was leaning against another fir tree, of which there was a cluster, with his head in his arm. I touched him lightly on the back, and he turned and said, "Don't be angry with me." "I'm not angry with you, dear boy. Come with me." And I took him to the library cart. I left him at the bottom of the steps while I went in. Sophie was sitting, drying her eyes. "You have been crying," I said. "Yes, Father." "Why?" "A headache, Father. Not a heartache." "I said a headache, Father. I must prescribe for that headache." She lifted up my book, held it up to me. But seeing that I did not move, she set it down very softly and looked at me attentively. "The prescription is not there, Sophie." "Where?" "Here." And I brought her young husband in, and I put her hand in his, and my own father words to the two of them were these: "Dr. Marigold's last prescription, to be taken for life." After which I bolted. When the wedding come off, I mounted a jacket, blue with brass buttons, for the first and the last time. There was only the three of us and the gentleman who had looked after her during those 2 years. And I give the wedding breakfast for 4 in the library cart. A leg of pickled pork, a pair of roast stuffed fowls, suitable garden stuff, you know, the best of drinks. I give a speech, the gentleman give a speech, all the jokes told, and the whole went off like a skyrocket. And when the entertaining was going on, I says to Sophie that I'd keep the library cart as a living cart when not on the road. And I'd keep all her books until she was ready to come back and fetch them. So she went away with her young husband off to China. And it was a parting painful and sorrowful. I got the boy I had a new position, and as of old, before my wife and child left me, I went walking on at the old horse's head with my whip over my shoulder. Sophie wrote me many letters, and I wrote her many letters. And after a year, I received one in an unsteady hand. "Dear Father, last week I had a little baby girl. But I am so well they let me write these words to you. Dearest, best Father, I hope she may not be deaf and dumb. But we do not yet know." Well, in my reply, I hinted the question, but since she never answered that question, I felt the answer to be an unhappy one, and I never repeated it. At first, our letters were regular, but then they became irregular. Well, what with her husband moving to a new station, and, well, me always being on the move, but we was in each other's thoughts. I was confident. Letters or no letters. 5 years, odd months had gone by since Sophie went away. And I was still the king of the cheapjacks. I'd had a first-rate autumn of it, and I found myself on the 23rd of December 1864 in Uxbridge, Middlesex, clean sold out. So I took the old horse, we trotted light and easy up into London so I could have my Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in the library cart, and then to buy a whole new stock of goods, sell them, get the money, you know. Now, I'm a pretty neat hand at cookery, and I'll tell you what I cooked for my Christmas Eve dinner. I cooked myself beefsteak pudding for one, a dozen oysters, a couple of mushrooms, a few kidneys thrown in. That is the type of pudding to put a man in the best of terms of everything except the bottom 2 buttons of his waistcoat. having relished that pudding, I cleared away and I turned down the lights and settled down and watched the fire and the light shining on the back of Sophie's books. Sophie's books. They so brought Sophie's self that I could see her touching face most plainly before I fell dozing before the fire. Perhaps that's why Sophie, with a little deaf and dumb child, seemed to stand watching me all through my nap. Even when I woke with a start, it was as if she'd been on that very spot just an instant before and then vanished. I'd started at a real sound. It was on the outside, on the steps of the cart, the light arid tramp of a little child coming clambering up. The step of a child on those steps was once so familiar to me that I half believed I was going to see a little ghost. But no. No, it was the hand of a real child that was laid on the outer handle of the door. And the door opened and a real child looked in. A bright little comely thing with large dark eyes. And then she took off a little mite of a straw hat, and a quantity of dark hair fell about her face. And then she opened her lips, and she said, in a pretty voice, "Grandfather?" Oh my God. Oh my God, she can speak. Yes, dear grandfather. And I'm to ask you if there was ever anybody I remind you of. And then Sophie was holding me round the neck and hiding her face, and her husband was wringing my arm and hiding his face, and we all had to thoroughly shake ourselves together to get over it. But when we did shake ourselves together, and when I saw that little child, a talking, eager, quick, busy to her mother, using the signs that I had first taught her mother, the happy yet pitying tears fell rolling down my face. And that is my story. Now, Judy did ask whether I'd be happy to do some question and answers like we did at Christmas, which I'm always very happy to do because it gives me a chance to talk more, which is my hobby. So if anyone has any questions at all, feel free to fly in about Charles Dickens, about myself, about almost anything. Yeah. Sort of both, which is a very non-committal answer. My father was a huge Dickens fan and scholar, so the house was always filled with books and biographies, and he was always writing articles and speeches. So yes, I was sort of aware of something around us. The first time it really made an impression on me was a date we talked a lot about in the first half, 9th of June, 1970, which was 100 years after Dickens died. And the family were invited to a memorial service at Westminster Abbey, which is where he's buried. And I was, I think, 6 at the time. And I was so bored by the whole affair, I can't tell you. It just seemed to go on forever. And I was looking around and and then suddenly, I noticed the Queen Mother was sat in the same pew as us. I've seen her on the telly. And that's when it really made an impression. That was the first time I realized that this was something incredibly out of the ordinary. So about the age of 6 was when it really hit. Yeah. Any more? Yeah.
I know you're professional, but how do you memorize so much in so long?
So someone at a previous event said, do I have a photographic memory? And sadly, no. I wish I did. Something like Marigold was a little bit different because when I first started performing that, I did it as a reading in the same way Dickens did. So for about 2 or 3 years, I was reading it over and over and over. So by the time I decided to do it like this, it was pretty well in there. But line learning, there's no secret magic. It's just going over and over and over. Now, it's very interesting because I've got myself into a state where I can, okay, it takes time, but I can learn big chunks like this. Tomorrow, I'm doing a show with another actor. And first of all, it's a show I normally do on my own. So part of the deal is I've got to remember what not to say. That's going to be the difficult bit, because it's sort of muscle memory. It just goes line, 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 it runs in. But trying to learn a script with cues and remembering when to come in and is so alien to me now. I haven't done it for so long. I'm finding that much more difficult than learning something like this. So it's just what you get used to. And it's a story, so you know where the story's going. You know where you're trying to go with it. Yeah. Thank you very much. Any more? Yeah. 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 The official period of mourning in Britain is 10 days up until the funeral on Monday. So I actually arrived in America on the day she died. I got the news as I got off the airplane and switched my phone on. So it's been a very strange period to be here, not at home. I mean, not strange to be here. It's been strange not to be at home. And watching everything unfold on the TV and on the news. But I will be back on Sunday, so I'll be back in time for the funeral. See that. So. Was Charles Dickens knighted? No, he never was. Probably with good reason. In that he had the strangest relationship with Queen Victoria. When she married Albert, he at that time was young, he's very popular, sudden flush of success, lots of money. So he went completely bizarre. He ran up to Windsor Castle, and under the window of the bedroom shared by Victoria and Albert, he serenaded Victoria, and then he threw himself on the ground and he pounded the ground, and he wrote letters to his friends saying, I can't bear my family anymore. All I want is Victoria. I'm going to throw myself off a bridge. I'm going to poison myself. I'm going to slit my throat. Completely bonkers. Anyway, as he went on, he became sort of quite a Republican sort of figure. But he always admired Victoria, although he didn't necessarily admire the institution of monarchy. And he was staging a play in London, and it was very popular. And the Queen wrote to him and said, will you come to perform it at Buckingham Palace? And he said, no, I won't. His excuse was his daughters were in the cast, and he didn't want them to be shown to the monarch as actresses, which had very bad connotations in society. So eventually it was agreed that he would do the play in the venue where it had been performed, and the Queen would come to see it. A private performance, but she would come to see it. So the play was done, and the Queen loved it. And she sent a note backstage to say, Mr. Dickens, so enjoyed watching your performance. Will you come and see me so I can thank you personally? And once again, he said, no. I'm still in my costume, he said. I can't possibly greet you in my costume. Well, she'd just seen the costume on the stage. It wasn't going to be a great surprise to her, was it? So he refused. And the Queen disappeared off into the night without having met Dickens. And then years later, when he was doing his readings, she wrote to him again, saying, I hear your readings are absolutely wonderful. Will you come to Buckingham Palace to read for me? Of course, he was much older by now, and presumably wiser. He wrote back to her saying, I do not perform for mere individuals. You must become part of a more general audience. So I think that's probably answered your question. Was he ever knighted? No, he never wasn't. Yeah, quite strange. Any more? The largest group was inevitably in Dallas. I was doing Christmas Carol for a huge software company, their Christmas party, and that was to about 2,000. And it was a really strange performance because 2,000 people in a banqueting suite, and it wasn't a very deep room, but it was very, very wide. So if I'm on stage, I'm trying to perform to the people right down there, and I'm trying to perform to the people right down there. But what they'd done, like here, we had video cameras on me, mounted right in front, and massive screens on both sides. It was like a rock concert. And I suddenly was aware, I caught sight of myself on the screen, that by trying to act to the people over there and the people over here, all that anyone was watching the screen ever got was just a profile. And they couldn't see any facial expression at all. So then I sort of started concentrating on the camera. So for a room with 2,000 people in, it became one of the smallest performances I've ever done because I was just doing that little lens. And because everybody was watching the screens, nobody was watching me, except the one person at the front. It was an extraordinary evening. And the software company had decided to give every guest a signed copy of A Christmas Carol. So I'd spent, earlier in that tour, I'd spent weeks in hotel rooms just signing. Signing. So I had 2,000 of those. And we got to the end of the evening, and I was absolutely shattered. And it was really late. It was about 12:30 or 1 in the morning or something like that. And the CEO of the company said, well, everyone else thank Mr. Dickens, and you'll see you've got a wonderful gift. You've got a signed copy of A Christmas Carol. And everybody, yay. And then he said, and I'm sure if you want them personalized, Mr. Dickens will be more than happy to do that. 2,000. Oh, what a night. But yeah, had to be Dallas. Yeah. Everything's bigger in Texas, yeah. Oh, yeah. Doughty Street, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that house he bought, if you didn't hear it, this is the house that now has the museum in London, 48 Doughty Street, which is the Charles Dickens Museum. He bought that, well no, he didn't buy that, he rented it. He never bought any house except the last one he lived in. He always rented houses. But that one was the one he moved into when he first became successful. So he just published Pickwick Papers, which was his first novel, and he was writing Oliver Twist. And that was an affluent neighborhood at that time. It was a new neighborhood, those were new houses then. And he moved in. So yeah, that's where he was writing those books. And yeah, it's a great museum. If you're ever in London, go to Doughty Street. It's a good museum. I live in Oxford, city of Oxford, just in northwest of London. Of any works, of any of them. There's an amazing movie version of Great Expectations, which was made in the 50s. David Lean directed it. That's extraordinary. The BBC did an incredible version of Bleak House. And they did it very cleverly, because normally the BBC adaptations of Dickens are sort of hour or 2 hour long, big pieces. This they did in half an hour, 30-minute chunks, 3 times a week. So it became like a soap opera, which is how Dickens wrote them. So everybody was just hanging on and waiting for the next episode. It was really good. That was a very good one. I'll say they're the top 2. Funny enough, just before coming here, I was watching on YouTube a version of The Signalman that was made in 1976, which is very, very good. Denham Elliott, who was in the Indiana Jones movies. He was playing the Signalman. It's really good. Yeah, that's right. But Dickens was so theatrical that his works lend themselves for adaptation, be it on stage, be it one man, be it audio, radio, or movie. They just adapt so easily. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't think it was even worth saying. I mean, we all know that's the best one. Yeah. Mr. Magoo, I have that. Yeah. The funny thing about the Muppets one is it's one of the closest adaptations of A Christmas Carol there is on the market, because it is told by a narrator. Okay, it's Great Gonzo and Rizzo rap, but which means you get a lot of the original descriptive text from the original novel, which most movies don't have. It's just dialogue. So I love the Muppets version. I mean, good for a joke, but absolutely seriously, it's a really good telling of the story. Yeah. And it gets a whole new generation into Dickens and storytelling. Any more before we wrap up? You're very welcome, as always. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a picture of someone I think you may recognize.
Bless him. This is,
Cedric.
yeah, well, we all called him Uncle Cedric. He wasn't actually an uncle. He was my father's cousin.
Right.
And he was responsible.